Regina, thank you so much for joining me today on an early Monday morning, as you said, or at least for you, 1 in the afternoon. I guess it's early. I get it.
On a foggy Monday afternoon. Let's just
What projects right now? I'm curious. Are you excited about?
um. Well, I just sat in last night with the great Chucho Valdez and Ron Carter and Lenny White. So that was
Wow.
really exciting for me. I love Afro-Cuban music. I love those guys, but it's been a dream of mine to play with Chucho for a long time. So that was just a thrill to be able to play with him and all those guys last night. Um, just trying to figure out what my next project is going to be, and that's always a bit of a stressor for me because I have so many things that I love, so many genres of music, so many things that I want to do in music, outside of music. So it's really difficult for me to
Hmm.
settle down and focus.
That's amazing. Yeah, I was wondering, what are the things that are the litmus tests, or the things that get you to focus on a project? What are the different variables that you consider when you make that decision?
Um, I always need deadlines. I work well with deadlines.
Hmm.
If you just say, "Oh, just let us know when you're ready," it never happens. Um, and that's just with everything. I've always had a really difficult time focusing on everything, on anything, which causes a lot of anxiety for me. So once people kind of place parameters on me, then it's the structure that I need. It's like my mom, when I moved out of the house and I was living here and I was good and grown. And she would sometimes call me and on the answering machine, she'd say, "Did you practice today?" And she'd giggle. But it's kind of sometimes what I needed to say, okay, get in there and do what you need to do. But, I just, once I can sit and settle down, it's like, what is it that feels really important to me at the time, for each project? And because I've never, each project is always so different, for me, that makes it a little bit difficult too because some, I'm not following, the theme is not the same. So I'm
Hmm.
not following a theme one, theme two, or record one, two, in a theme. So so sometimes that makes it difficult. But um, right now, I don't, I know I have to figure out what a next record will be. I don't know. I have to sit myself down, but I'm very interested. I do hospice volunteer work. And
Wow.
so, I'm really, right now, I have a very strong calling for that, and really a strong calling to sit with people when they're dying, like the last stages of their life. I have a strong, and so I'm following that. I think for a long time, I felt like if I didn't, if I, if I wanted to do anything other than perform on stage, um, I felt guilty about it.
Mm.
I felt like you have this gift and you're supposed to.
Sorry, that's a party foul right there.
Dun, 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 dun.
Sorry, I should. Now I just learned from that I'm going to turn my phone off in the future. Oh, it's bad. Wait, I'm just going to turn it off. There you go. Sorry.
It's okay. Um, yes, I used to feel like if I didn't want to perform on stage, that was kind of a slap in the face to God. Like you're supposed to just play music. And so, I was talking to a minister once, and she said, "No, God gives us many gifts, and you can use your music or other gifts that you have, use your music for that." So they kind of gave me permission to not feel like I had to always just record or always perform or always, there I can use my music in other ways, which is it's really beautiful to be able to use music to help people feel better or to soothe them if they're feeling uptight, whether it be with hospice work or in hospitals or nursing homes, wherever it might be. Music serves so many purposes, and I tend to forget that.
Mm. When you go to hospices or how does that look like? What is it like? I mean, can you describe like a typical gig at when you're volunteering at a hospice?
Yeah, well, when I first trained, I wanted to work with people in their homes. Um, because so many people, especially older people, the elderly, a lot of that population, they live alone and they might not have other family members to help. Where even in the hospital, they might not have family members, but I feel like there's people around them, there's life around them. So I had three patients, whom unfortunately have all passed away. But my first patient, I remember getting the call, and her name was Grace, and that was my mother's name.
Mm,
And I had been waiting a long time, so I thought, okay, there's a signal that I'm doing the right thing.
mm,
And I remember calling her, and she seemed a bit confused, and so I called, and a little irritated. So I called her sister, and her sister said, "Yeah, Grace doesn't like anyone calling her before noon," and blah blah blah, which was so my mother. Don't call. So already I felt like, okay, I know how to deal with you, you know. And I got there, and here's this like close to 90-year-old woman who would have to climb up and down 14 stairs to let people in. And she lived by herself, and her 80-something-year-old sister would come and try and see about her. But it was just, she just pretty much was there. Her eyesight was so bad, she couldn't really see the TV. She'd listen to the radio. So, sometimes I played music for her. She'd want to hear different things, but sometimes it was really just about being there
mm.
and keeping her company and talking about things, or sitting with her while she had her meals. She wanted her independence, so I'd go grocery shopping for her, but I wouldn't try and cook for her because that's something she could still do. So it's like learning to not, like, you're not saving someone, you can't save them, you still have to let them live and have as much independence as they have, and just to really be there. And it really put my life in perspective when I would be upset about something or anxious about something, and to sit and talk to her and to know like she's waiting to make that transition. It just really put my stuff in perspective to say,
Mm.
you know what, all this you're worrying about, you're going to leave it behind, and it's not that big of a deal. And not to say that our issues aren't real, they are, but when you're with someone like that, it just really helps to put everything in perspective.
Well, I'm curious how volunteering for hospice, well, two things actually. One is how that has affected your feelings being a performer on stage or when you're working on your projects, but also what motivated you to get into that work.
I think what motivated me to get into hospice work was, when my mom was making her transition. Um, I went home to be with her, not knowing that she'd had cancer, and she had fought it and won like three times. So I thought this was just going to be one of those times she was going to beat this thing. And I was out on the road, and I got a phone call, "You need to come home." And so I was home, and I think I was home for 3 months, and I was practically living in the hospital, just trying to really be there for her. And just seeing, like, a lot of times that nurses have way too many patients
Mm.
in certain hospitals. So, you might ring that button and it takes them forever. Everyone needs an advocate when they're in the hospital. Um, and I learned to do a lot to help take care of her. But um, I, s- I had one gig that I was supposed to do, and I was going to leave, and the doctor finally told me she's not going to she'll only be here a couple more days. So I canceled that gig, and I was sued for canceling that gig, it made me really bitter at the same time as being really, just here I'm angry already because I'm losing my mother. But then for someone to not understand that she's dying and to sue me over it made me even more bitter. And I just said, I hate the music business. So I had a really negative outlook towards the music business and just didn't want to do it anymore. And I remember John Clayton is the one that just saved me, because he said, if you stop playing music, then you've allowed them to win. You can't let them steal that joy. And that could happen in any business, not just music.
Right.
And I didn't play for my mom, but I would take CDs in and put music on, because at a certain point she couldn't communicate, but I knew she could still hear. And certain recordings I put on, and her vital signs would get really crazy, and then I take that off and put something else on, and they calm back down. So, you hear people say music is really powerful. It's really, it can heal people, make you, and you just, sometimes it just sounds like, yeah, kind of airy fairy. But it's when you see it like that, it's so incredibly powerful. And just being there for her, I just think, man, how many other elderly people are here that don't have someone? And I just wanted to be there for them.
Mm.
No matter what age you are, I think the way we deal with death or don't deal with it and don't talk about it in the United States, it makes it sometimes this thing that's bigger than life. And I, as a child, was always, I lost a friend when I was 8, and I just, as an 8-year-old, you can't really understand what death really is. And so I've always kind of been consumed with what happens to us. So this kind of helped me. I feel like it's my link between this and the other side, so to speak, and not to make it not so scary. But so that's, and I wanted to use music, but I didn't want to just necessarily go in and just play for people. I want to play for them if they want to hear music, but I just want to be there and hold their hand if that's what they need. And it affects me when I think about that and I'm on stage. There's so many things that the voices in our heads can really mess with us. And I really have to fight those voices all the time. And, I'm thinking, this is self-esteem issue, really. And do people like me? You look in the audience, you might see someone kind of sitting like this and, they're bored. And all of a sudden my attention, instead of playing for everyone else, is trying to make them like me, or make this magic happen, or play a killing solo, or play. And we can't control any of that, So if I can think about that, I try to say, get out of the way, get out of my own way, and just you might not play a whole bunch of notes on this solo. You might not play as fast as this guy. You might not play all these you play what you play what you play. And what I usually play is very simple, but if I'm out of my way and I'm trying to let the music flow through me and connect to the spirit, if you will, then it's okay. It's okay, because we can't control any of that. And once I can remember that and let it go, then the music is fun, and I can be present in the music and with everyone else on the bandstand.
That really touches me to hear you talk about it that way, because, I mean, working in hospice like you did, you feel like that connects you to the spirit in a different way, like in the spirit of who you are, what it means for you to be a musician, what it is that you're called to do, how it is that you're connecting with the audience, what is important in you as a musician and in your voice. Is that all connected to the idea of the spirit? And do you feel like working in hospice allows you to connect with that more?
Yeah, I definitely believe hospice, I don't want to say taught me that, but brought that to light. That we're all spiritual beings having a physical experience. And if I can remember that and hold on to that, I definitely think it helps me in the music, because we are, when you're on stage and you're playing with musicians, and it's just like afterwards, everyone feels on this high. You feel like, man, that was so killing. And the audience like really reacted. And it's not anybody on that stage that did that. They were able to let go, not let their egos get in the way, and I think connect in a spiritual place. I really believe when we play music, if we can let go, that we go somewhere else and we meet each other and we have these conversations, not with our minds. It's not with our mouths, rather, but the music in our minds, and that's how I think spirits communicate. I know it sounds crazy, but I really, and I think the audience feels that. They respond to that. It's like being in church, and when people get happy, it's the spirit. And I can't help but go back to that night that you were playing with Paquito, the Bird with Strings project, and you took that solo. I'm telling you, the hairs stood up.
You're too kind.
I was
Thank
just
you.
I told you that I was throwing something at you. And it was that the spirit, and I could tell that the spirit hit you. We could all see it. The spirit hit you. The spirit was in you.
I also like that you sort of talked about on one hand these kind of um, the self consciousness that we feel, or the insecurities that we might think, or the distractions that we feel sometimes when we're playing, that have to do with all these, for lack of a better word, almost academic musical things, and also getting so caught up in a measure of ourself as being how fast we play or whether every note is perfect. Whereas when you go to volunteer in hospice and you put your instrument down and you hold someone's hand, that's sort of recognizing that we're not just our instrument, we're not just how we play. There's just one part of how we connect with people, but it's fundamentally us and other things about us that make us a whole person, you know. I don't know if that makes sense if you
Yeah,
agree with
yeah,
that.
no, it's a huge, beautiful reminder, of what really this at our core being, what we're about, what we're supposed to be about, and all this other crap, these layers, just not even just in music, but in life in general, and what people get upset over, um, and just the hatred that people spew at one another, and not, just even, I look on social media sometimes, and I'm always saddened, especially when I see musicians or artists that can be so nasty and say such nasty things to each other, because I feel like we're supposed to be the most pure because we can connect with that spirit a lot easier maybe than other people. So I get it makes me really sad, but I think if we can let go and get out of our own ways, like that's yeah, something like hospice is just a huge reminder,
Hmm.
because I don't I whatever someone wants to judge someone else over doesn't we're all leaving this all behind.
Hmm. Hmm. I can't help but ask the question in relation to this because it just comes up for me that you know, and I specifically didn't necessarily want to go into contrived directions in this interview with you um, and speak out of place, but just thinking about how you're a woman in jazz and how your perspective about music, you know, talking about hospice and stuff like this, it makes me think, what would the music world be like if there were more women, if there were more femininity, for lack of a better way to put it. Do you have any opinion about that, or is that something you feel comfortable talking about?
Yeah, I just think the world over, you know, and I'm not male bashing in any kind of way, I just women are brought up to feel. That's what kind of creatures we are. Even when we talk, if we're in a conversation, we usually say, "Well, I feel blah blah blah,"
Mm.
and men say, "I think this."
Mm.
So even right there, it's really interesting. And I think women, at least I know me, I overanalyze everything. We spend a lot of time as women thinking about things, mulling them over, needing to talk about it, needing to, how did that make us feel, and blah blah blah. Where men, it's just like, here it is, blah blah blah. They're on to the next thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just we're different in that way. And I think sometimes a lot of issues would be solved in a more positive light if women were dealing with them.
Mhm.
Or sometimes if men could just stop and say, you know what, let me back up and think about this. Or I don't know. Um it's interesting. It's interesting. When all this Me Too started coming out and you saw all these people on television, all these men that had been very inappropriate with women, and they started losing their jobs. I remember one day my husband looked at me. He goes, "One day we're going to turn on the television, and all the news stations is just going to be all women." And I was like, "Yeah, wouldn't be a bad." It just and not to say that there maybe aren't some women that are inappropriate. We're human beings. They're going to be, but I just think on too, just the way we're raised. Parents raise their sons differently than they raise their daughters. I saw it in my own house. I remember my oldest brother. my two brothers and I, we all live in New York. And so my oldest brother, my mom once said, why don't you go over there and like, you know, like basically clean his apartment, help him. I'm like, man, he's making enough money to hire all of us, cleaning service. Why should I?
Mm-hmm.
But she expected that she would never tell him to come to my house and clean up.
Mm-hmm.
It was just how that old fashioned thing of this is what women do. Although she never expected me or wanted, she never pushed marriage on me. She never pushed children on me. It's just like, if you want to play music, and that's fine. But there's certain ways that we're raised, those roles. I think it's going to take a really conscious effort on the part of parents to raise their children mindfully, and to not raise us as boys or girls, but to raise us as equal children.
Yeah. I can only imagine that, because it's, you're really so respected and so well known in the jazz industry, and as one of relatively few female artists in jazz. I can only imagine that would create a lot of pressure. And I'm curious if a lot of people have constantly looked to you to be a role model or to give advice for younger women. And if you enjoy being in that position, or if that's something you'd rather not have to deal with, because, why does it always have to be about that? Or is there do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, when I was younger, I didn't want to be put in that position. I was like, why do I have to be the role model? But as I've matured, you just are. When you're out here, no matter what, we're all role models. Someone's always looking at us, whether we want them to or not. They're looking at the way, and we never know who's watching us and watching our behavior, the way we approach things. So that just is, the performance starts once we leave our front door. And I don't mind speaking to young women, because I didn't necessarily have anyone to talk to, not another woman when I was coming up, but I did have men in the business that I really respected, and they really respected me. And I think they probably knew how difficult it could be for me being a woman, or, I think the most, pushback I got when I got to New York was because I was a violin player, not because I was a woman.
Interesting.
And so, but I had folks coming up in Detroit. There was a very strong music scene there, and one of my teachers was a great trumpet player, Marcus Belgrave. And he would teach. So many of us came through him: Jerry Allen, Bob Hurst, Rodney Whitaker, just the list goes on. And so he taught us about being in a band, leading a band, and just so many great musicians I worked with, like in Detroit on the scene. I never experienced any weirdness because I was a woman. And really, I never experienced, I've been fortunate enough. I think I haven't experienced, the only thing I've experienced sometimes is that people want to try me. Like they want to disrespect me on my bandstand, and it shouldn't matter if it's mine or theirs. Like they might not learn the music and just think they're just going to come on the gig, where I know they wouldn't do that with a guy. But because it's my music, they think they can just come, and it's like, okay, I'm not hiring you again. And there's certain cultures too that, the way they treat women is it's almost second class citizens, and, you go to some cultures, and instead of coming to me, although the presenter knows I'm the band leader, they go to one of the guys in the band. Now, when I was younger, that would bother me, because I'd be like, I'm the band leader, you come to, but I'm older. I know it's their culture. I'm not going to change them. That's their culture. It's not mine. As long as the guys in the band respect me, they know, as long as we get what we need, go ahead and tell them. It doesn't bother me. But I think young women, it seems now, and maybe always, I have had friends that have had issues with men being inappropriate with them. I think we have to really teach young girls how to deal with that. And how do you teach someone to deal with that. You can say, go tell someone immediately, but we've been reading story after story of young women that have gone to the heads of the department or the school, and they get chastised as if it's their fault. Or they sweep it under the rug, and it doesn't, and they have to go through school feeling embarrassed, or they drop out of school. So, the question becomes then, if you go to someone higher up and nothing gets done, then what do you do? Who do you go to? Do you go to the police? And I think women have to be taught to physically defend themselves as well, which is really, everybody should just know that anyway. But it's just really sad to think that way. If I had a daughter, to think, I want her to know how to defend herself physically, if that becomes necessary. But I also want her to learn with words and forcefulness, like, no, that's not cool. That's not, and that you don't have to take it. But sometimes it's not even a sexual thing. Sometimes it's, I've read stories where they try to make young, there was a young lady who was soloing, and this one teacher tried to make her feel like she wasn't playing like one of the guys. And she was, and it's just, what I've learned is unfortunately, that's that person's issue, not the young lady. That's that teacher. Well, he's got some issues. And if you could stay away from those people, any negative people, because we're all human beings, we got our issues, we got our crap. When I run into musicians like that, then I say, okay, you know what? I don't want to do a gig if they're on it. So I find out who's in the band, and I don't take the gig, or I don't hire them. I just keep myself out of that situation, because I shouldn't have to pretend that it doesn't bother me. I shouldn't have to deal with that.
It's amazing. Again, it brings up for me just how much more, what other things are kind of important besides just the notes people play. And in the case of this teacher referenced in the story, they were telling a woman, sound more like a guy, which I think about your message in music about being authentic and connecting with the audience and being true to your calling or your voice, or at least that's what I take from what you're talking about, like getting out of the way, and that these things are so much more important anyway in musicianship. I don't know, I just rambled. but it really resonates with me. I wanted to ask you a question about something you said earlier about how when you went to New York, you felt like, if anything, you got pushback from jazz musicians because you played the violin, which I can relate to that. I'm curious if you got pushback. What was the attitude when you were coming up into the jazz world? What was the attitude that you received from other people in the classical world, like other violinists who you could relate to as a violin player, but you couldn't relate to in terms of jazz versus classical maybe, or whatever? Do you remember that, or did you get pushback on that?
No, actually, when I was young, and I started when I was 4, pretty young like you, I think, and I did Suzuki. And my teacher, though, was so cool, because she would do these exercises where sometimes she'd line us up and on the Saturday class, and she'd start to make up a melody, and then when she tapped you, you had to continue that continue. So you're improvising in, classical style, but it's telephone tag, so to speak, which was fun. And so she really got all of us into the mindset of not having to be on the paper. Plus, we didn't start with reading,
right.
So I think it helped. But she would tell my mom, I came up in the 60s, and she would always tell my mom, I know she wants to be a classical violinist, but she's going to have a really difficult time as an African American getting into an orchestra. I don't think it's going to happen.
Wow.
And that was real. But, that I've always been, that was kind of in my mind, I didn't want to be in the orchestra. I wanted to be the soloist with the orchestra.
Sure.
So from the get-go, it was just like, I didn't want, and I loved being on stage. I loved, my mom said you were a ham when you were little. So, I took dance. I loved being on stage. So I think when I was introduced to jazz and knew that you could do this other music on violin, I just, this was it. There were
Mm.
no second thoughts about it. This is it. And I remember at that time, I was in high school, I had a different classical teacher, and he used to tell me, you're going to ruin your career.
Oh, geez. Yeah, right. Okay.
And I had a master class, my quartet did, with Yehudi Menuhin under him. And
Wow.
he said to Yehudi Menuhin, she wants to play jazz. She's going to ruin her career. And Yehudi picked up his violin and played a little blues lick and said, leave her alone. I'll never forget that. It was
Oh,
just
wow.
like, woo, God has spoken. So, I knew then, and I didn't know how, or but when the passion is there, you can't ignore it. The calling, when it chooses you, you just have to go with it.
Mhm.
So my other no, my other violin friends, very very supportive. I was still playing European classical as well, but they were really supportive, and a lot of them tried improvising too. So I went to a really famous high school called Cass Tech in Detroit, and basically I was in, you had to know what you wanted to major in college when you went there, and you had to keep your grade point average really high. And so they had two really strong orchestras, bands, choir, harp and vocal, all of this. And um just a kid, it was just a really supportive community of musicians.
Mm.
And I got into the jazz band there, and the kids would be in between classes. We'd get together and play tunes, or that someone would be working on a tune that we would all learn and play. So there was no weirdness that I got from my peers then.
Wow.
And it was just only when I spent 2 years at New England Conservatory. That was a little interesting because during my audition, they were like, there's no such thing as jazz violin. And I'm like, yes, there is. Listen, folks, like, are you kidding me? So I spent 2 years there, and then I couldn't deal with Boston. So I went back to Michigan. I went to school up in Rochester, Michigan, called Oakland University. And when I went to the big band director there and said, I want to play jazz, he said, okay, sit in the saxophone section. He put me in the alto section. You're going to read alto charts. Breathe when they breathe,
Mm.
phrase how they phrase, and stop listening to violin players.
Ah!
He goes, there's too few of you out there, and you're going to sound like them. You want to
Mm.
find your own voice, which I'm so thankful to him, Doc
Yeah.
Marvin Holliday. And so,
Wow.
and then there was, like I said, a thriving jazz scene in Detroit. So I was hooked up with trumpeter Marcus Belgrave. I was
Right.
working with the pianist Ken Cox. Donald Walden had a jazz loft. He would do things with strings. We'd have these great string charts. So it wasn't until I got to New York. I remember going to a jam session with another great friend from Detroit, Mickey Braden, and we went to this club and we signed up to sit in, and we saw all these people coming in after us, going on before us, and we kept saying, but we signed up a long time ago. Why? And finally, he let us go, and he sees my violin. The guy running, he goes, "Oh, what's she gonna do with this little violin?"
Mm-hmm.
And I was just so turned off by that, but I didn't let him ruin my experience. I just said, okay, those are your issues.
Mm.
I didn't go back there. And then I started going to other clubs that had jam sessions
Wow.
and sitting in. So I just learned, and even, I was fortunate enough to work with some really great musicians at a young age. And even when I moved here, working with people like Kenny Barron or the String Trio, and it were always with men who treated me with the utmost respect.
Mm.
So once you're around that enough, you know that you don't have to put up with that.
Mm.
They're
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
An a-hole is an a-hole, whether they're male or female, and you don't have to put up with that.
That's amazing. Yeah, because, thinking on my own experience, I remember feeling like that it was really, for whatever reason, my perception was that it was hard to be respected or included because I played the violin. I mean, whether it was in rock bands or R&B bands or jazz bands, and that could have been my own projection. I think sometimes the image that I think of is like going to to a jam session and walking up with my violin case and people on the stage sort of like seeing the look get over their face and hearing the excuses coming like, well, the list is already full
Right.
it's kind of like someone at, McDonald's, they tell you the espresso machine's down, the machine's broken because they don't want to make you an espresso. They come up with these excuses why they're not going to let you up on the stage. And I remember it created so much conflicting feelings for me, but also that I felt like I didn't get a lot of buy-in or support from the classical community. Although I'm guessing that it may have been different in Detroit. There may have been a different culture in Detroit or at the school where you attended. I'm not really sure, but what I loved about what you just talked about was that your Suzuki teacher at the age of 4 or 5, for that person, it was so natural to include improvisation in your early training. And it wasn't rocket science, right? Like that just made it feel natural. And then also the way that your college big band teacher dealt with bringing you into the big band, and the fact that these things happen in like early 1970s and 1990s. I mean, and people today are still grappling with these very simple things that people can do to better integrate,
Right.
different musical styles and skills, right? I mean,
Right. And instruments. I still hear sometimes I'll have string players say to me, the jazz band teacher won't let me in because they don't have charts for, and I have to tell them that you'll read the alto charts,
mm-hmm.
and if you can't read alto, then take them home and transcribe it and just keep pushing because this is what you want to do. Just keep, and sometimes people just want to see how badly do you want to do something.
Right. Yeah.
There's always, my mother would say, there's always several ways around the speed bump.
I love that. Well, you mentioned that when you went to, and I've heard this before, that when you first went to New York, you played with a lot of Latin bands. Is that a fair way to describe it, or could you talk more about that?
No, I actually, when I first got here, I was playing more on the downtown scene. The String Trio of New York, the Dave Soldier Quartet.
Can you explain that for people that may not know what the downtown scene is?
I don't even know what it means.
Okay.
But, a lot of the bands that were playing pieces, not your jazz standards,
mm-hmm.
But
more contemporary, right? I mean,
pieces by like brilliant composers like Anthony Davis, Wadada Leo Smith, Anthony Davis, Muhal Richard Abrams. And a lot of the pieces might have altered techniques, which
right.
is something I remember the first time I think I saw a piece by Wadada Leo Smith, and it had looked like math equations in the music and some other, and I freaked out and I called the guys in the string trio and I was like, I can't do this. I don't even know what this is. I don't what does this mean? I've never seen this. And they were like, oh, don't worry, you'll be in it. I just, until I got there, and then I saw and they explained to me what it meant. And it really stretched me musically, stretched my mind, stretched my playing. I think it was a great experience to have. And with the Soldier Quartet, but the altered, sometimes having to put a paper clip in between the strings or paper and get these other sounds, which is great, because a lot of times, we grow up with playing European classical music, and if it's a standard repertoire, you might not use any of those techniques. And we all have this misconception of what the violin is and what it can do. And it's like, no, it's way more than that. It's just a piece of wood with some strings on it. and that's, if you look at it like that, it has all kinds of possibilities. But then I don't even know how I met these guys, but I went to a club called Gonzales y Gonzales in New York, and it was a charanga band, and it was great violinists Rob Thomas, Ali Bayo, and Sam Bardfell, killing string players, and then it flute and percussion, no drum set, piano, bass, and the singers, and that music just touched something really deep in me. And I used to love to go and dance and listen to them. I don't know. And I think maybe I sat in once, and then like I would sub for those guys, or sometimes he'd use a fourth violinist. And I've never been a strong sight reader. So that really would kick my butt, because sometimes like Johnny would just pull up some charts and I'd be like, okay, well, might not be the note, but I could hear. I think because of the Suzuki, I'd hear where it was going, and it would be, I'd pick a note, it'd be in the chord in the rhythm group, but wasn't what was on that paper, So, but I played with him for years and just learned so much about that music. And then I had a chance to work with the pianist Oriente Lopez, who was from Cuba, and then I had a chance to go to Cuba, and just I just that music, I love it. I can't still sit still when I hear it, and there's so much to learn about that music. But people like Sam and Ali they really have dug into that music and really know it really well. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Well, do you think that, I mean, it's occurring to me that you have very eclectic tastes. You love to do it all in music. I mean, you love classical music. You played straight ahead. You've done African project. You've done, a tribute to music from the South. You've played in Latin influenced bands. You played in the downtown scene, which a lot of people would describe as sort of like the free jazz or whatever. And I know you've also done really traditional leaning, more early jazz stuff. Would you say that because there's such a rarity of violinists, or that's what allows string players in New York the opportunity to be so eclectic, and that otherwise, if you played a different instrument, people would try to pigeonhole you into one style? So in other words, it's like, if you go to New York, like whether it's a Latin band or a downtown thing or anything that's looking for a string player, there's only a handful of people they're going to call. Do you think that's true, and that helped you to be able to work in so many different scenes, or not?
I don't know. I never thought of it that way. That's
Okay.
an interesting. That's an interesting point. I remember when I first moved to New York, and I had some numbers of people to call, and one person I spoke to said, be careful doing all this different music, because people are going to say you're not serious. And I think growing up in Detroit, there were so many cultures that migrated to Detroit because of the automotive industry and because of Motown. So I was in neighborhoods and going to school with, like, Detroit has the largest Arab community outside, the Chaldean population is in Detroit, the largest community. So I go to school and have friends that were from, all over the world. There's a huge Greek population, huge Polish, Mexican, just everything. So you're in school with these people, you're friends with them, you go to their homes, you're eating the food from their homes, and you're hearing music, their classical music a lot of times. So I was exposed to a lot of different cultures and their music at a very early age. And the one thing I remember one day just kind of stopping and saying, wow, almost in every music that exists on the planet, there's a stringed instrument, whether it's violin or an instrument that the violin is related to.
Mm-hmm.
And that then was just, I found that to be pretty exciting, and I just felt like I could fit in so many different genres because there's strings almost in everything. There's strings. There's some strings that exist. So I think because of that, I felt like I didn't have any limitations. Like, when you gotta work, you gotta work. So when I was here and I had to pay that rent, it's like, oh, there's a Motown band, I could do that, play some strings, sing some backgrounds. Oh, there's this, yes, I could. And I think, maybe I think of it more because those musics all include strings, that is easier. But yeah, like you said, because there's so few of us, it's not like being a saxophonist where, if I were trying to do all that, then maybe people would say, no, you can't do that. But I think it helps being a string player in that sense.
Hearing you talk about, your life and your training, it feels like it was in some ways almost seamless, like how you've done so many different things as a musician. and that there weren't, there weren't necessarily huge barriers to doing all these different things. But based on the story about your big band teacher in college who didn't stop you, or your Suzuki teacher who sort of effortlessly integrated the idea that improvisation, I'm sure there were other things that weren't as easy, but hearing you talk about it, it's refreshing, this idea of, having a life as a musician that can be so diverse. And I wonder if you feel like the classical music world or the jazz music world, you know, um, if there's anything that they can do to make the training for other young people to be as seamless as it seemed like it was for you. Like, is there anything that you would like to see change in classical music education or in the jazz industry in terms of pedagogy?
Well, I think especially, well, I'm happy to see more now that well, for schools that still have music, um, that teachers seem to be introducing jazz to their string players at an early age. And it's great to see that there are folks out here, string players, that are writing pieces for string players, string orchestras, so they have some repertoire to play, and or some of the teachers can um, transcribe tunes that are on the radio that their kids are. I think we have to reach children where they are, and then you can, I was talking to Lenny White about that last night, about like how a lot of times in institutions they try to just say this is what you have to learn, and they're starting
Mm,
from something that these kids have no connection to. But if you start where they are and kind of work backwards, or let them see this is where that came from, this was influenced by this, then they'd be a little more interested. But I'm always shocked sometimes still to hear classical violin players will say, some say, their teachers say, oh, don't listen to that music, or to think that jazz or any other music is a lesser music than European classical music. And that's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous mindset, because you're not only talking about a music, you're talking about the people
right,
from which that music comes, which
right.
is, um, but I think they do their students a disservice, because when you get out here, how many seats are available in these major orchestras?
Mm, right.
These people stay there and they retire. So how many seats are going to open up, and what are you going to do? You may not be able to be a soloist with an orchestra, so you have to be able to um, diversify.
Yeah.
If you want to pay the rent. And I think, and I think it just makes you a better musician. Even if you don't want to play jazz or play any other style of music outside of European classical music, I think hearing and being exposed to it, it can only add to your musicality.
Yeah, well said. And it takes me back to what we talked about in the beginning, in relation to your working in hospice. That, what is our purpose as musicians? To get out of the way, to allow the spirit to come through, to connect with people. And if we're so caught up in, who's got the most flawless vibrato, and it sort of gets in the, it sort of gets in the way. But having more, um, I keep, yeah, just having more diverse experiences, playing music, because there's also different the way that you play music when you're in an orchestra versus other contexts, other cultural contexts or whatever. And every time you get a chance to do that, it really opens you up to what it is to be a musician, I think, and I feel like the classical world is sort of missing out on that,
Yeah,
and
and the mindset is an interesting thing. And I don't know if you experienced this when you were coming up as a string player, but in the European classical world, it was just so competitive a lot of times, and just, I think it almost made it there. The one thing I noticed when I got to New York and I would watch, especially jazz musicians, but like drummers or trumpet players, there was a community. Like, they would support each other. They
mm,
go to each other's gig. They hang out and listen to music. They do. But like with European classical violinists, string players, like I had my group of people that I grew up with, and
mm,
we they were my friends too, because that's all I was doing was music pretty much, and that's all so we were the geeky music kids, and we're still all really good friends. They live everywhere, but you know, a lot of times, like once I got to the conservatory, it was like this competition, especially if you're working on the same piece or who, and then you feel like you're competing for this job, the same job when you get out, and it was just it there was no sense really of community, and some of that I find in the jazz world, but luckily I feel like more than not there's more of a sense of community. Like string players will support each other more so in jazz.
Mhm.
And I think the ones that the ones that don't, I think they still have that mentality that there's only one gig, one seat.
Yeah.
And and I remember having a conversation with someone once, and I had to say they were saying that they hoped another jazz violinist who was up and coming. They said, "I hope she gets there. I hope she makes it there." And I said, "Makes it where?" I said, the fact that any of us are doing this,
Right.
we're making it.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
doing something we love in life. No matter what, if you're doing something you love, you're making it. There is no there. There is no, there's always something to learn. And there's always going to be someone better than us that we can learn from. And there's no one gig, no one seat. We all have a purpose here. And I think if we can remember that, we can be supportive of one another and be there and root each other on, because we are all on our own journey.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it makes me think that in other areas of music where there is a creative voice is encouraged, the individual creative voice is encouraged, that somehow that lends itself to being more supportive, because we're not comparing ourselves necessarily in the same way. Because it's like, I can say Regina sounds like Regina, I sound like me, Sarah sounds like Sarah, whoever it might be, and we can celebrate those differences. And I think that's part of being a creative musician. Whereas if we're all vying for a chair in a section, it's like, who played better, who
Right.
played worse, it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. I think even probably in like Wynton's band, there's like 4 trumpet players and they sort of all celebrate, their individual sound. And that, I don't know, that's just one thing that came up for me, it's one of the advantages of being a creative musician, or going beyond just the limits of playing classical music.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah, I remember meeting a young woman once. Was I in South Carolina, and she works for El Sistema now there. And she was saying when she was in school, did she go to Juilliard or I can't remember, but they were auditioning for, I guess, the first violin chair, and then they would post it on the wall who, the audition, who got what seat, blah blah blah. And she saw this girl that she didn't know who got the concert mistress chair, and she goes, "Oh, she must have studied with this person, and she must have studied. She obviously, all these." And then she said she met the young lady and found out she was out of the El Sistema program and just
killed
worked her, worked to get there. And she said that really changed her whole mindset after that,
Wow.
because sometimes, you could get this, well, I studied with blah, 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 just, yeah, doesn't matter.
Well, I was planning to ask you to talk about different clips today, but you've been so generous with your time. What I'm hoping to do is to later on grab some clips, and I'm going to insert them into the interview, and so I don't take too much of your time today. And I might ask you to give me some commentary on it later in writing. But I wanted to ask you, where can people find you online? Where can they look for stuff about Regina Carter online?
I have a website. I'm old school. reginacarter.com.
Sweet.
I have a Facebook page. Social media and me don't get along. I'm like a dinosaur. But I have a Facebook page, and I'm on Twitter. And yeah, I'm old school, so I don't know. I don't have all the other accounts, but that's pretty much.
Well, I really, really appreciate you spending time and agreeing to do this interview. It means a lot to me. I know it's going to mean a lot to other people.
Thank you, Christian. Really, I am. And I'm a big fan of yours, so.
You're too kind. And I just want to acknowledge you, there's so many things I could acknowledge you about you, but one of the things that comes up for me today that I'm just so inspired by is your grace, your authenticity, your keeping it real. I feel like in so many ways you really embody grace and you embody gracefulness, and it's really it's inspiring. It's inspiring. I'm inspired by you. Thank you.
Thank you.